I'm going to go ahead and kick this session off because I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions at the end, so I'm going to make this short. I'm just going to remind all of you if you could please fill out surveys for these sessions using the app that you've downloaded hopefully onto your phones. But with that, I'm going to pass it off to Paxton Hare, and he's going to take you through the best way to build a data hub.
All right, can everyone hear me? Awesome. All right. This is what we're going to talk about today. At least this is the abstract that you guys read. Hopefully you're in the right room. If you're not, you should be here anyways because this is going to be an awesome talk. I am super excited to talk to all of you about what we at MarkLogic believe is the best way to build a data hub. Today I'm going to show you that it is possible to easily create an operational data hub using MarkLogic without having to waste years on costly development. Who wants to see that? Who's excited to see that? All right, let's do it then. First of all, I'm Paxton. I've been at MarkLogic for about 8.5 years. I'm the lead developer on the Data Hub Framework, and I've worked my way from consulting to pre-sales, and now I'm in the illustrious community team. I have some good news and bad news, but I'm going to start off with the bad news. Some of you might already know this, but building data integrations is really hard. It costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time. But there is some good news, and that good news is that MarkLogic makes it really easy to do this stuff, and I'll be showing you how. In this talk, I have two key takeaways that I want you to go home with. The first one, you need to build a MarkLogic operational data hub. And the second takeaway is that the MarkLogic Data Hub Framework will make this super easy for you. So let's talk about the first one. You need to build a MarkLogic operational data hub. How do I do this? I have data distributed across multiple silos. Each silo has its own unique purpose and use case. And I want to ask some questions. But those questions require bits of data from each of these silos. So it's not really that straightforward. How do I get the answers to my questions from all of these places? And then not only that, but after I've asked the question, perhaps I want to take some sort of action. And then with the information I have after taking the action, I want to put that back into the system. How do I do that? Well, typically, what we might do is create a new data silo. So let's take our existing data, perform some sort of ETL on it, and load it into a new silo so that we can answer these new questions about this data. That's great, but there's some issues with this. This here you see looks a little bit like a waterfall, and that's because it is a waterfall. In order for us to build a new data silo, we have to do all of these steps, right? We have to design everything up front before even able to load the data into our new silo. And then to make things a little bit more complicated, all these original silos that had data in them, they were complex relational models. And to get this into a new system, we have to create new models. But because this data is so complicated, we're going to have to make some sacrifices in our modeling steps. We're going to have to leave some data behind because it's just too complicated to bring it across. So the problem that this produces is later on, something's going to change. And something always changes. So when that happens, now we're stuck because we didn't bring across all the data that we needed. We have to go back to the drawing board and start over. Another approach is the federated approach. And in the federated approach, we're going to real-time query all of our data silos, ask the questions that we need answered, and then aggregate those results on the fly and return them. There's some problems with this approach, too. First of all, it's complex to develop. Next, there's too many moving parts. Things are going to easily break. And we're only as fast as our slowest system because we're querying in real time. And then we're going to have a little bit of limitations in our query expressiveness because we're relying on what our upstream systems are able to give us. Then sorting is going to be difficult, and we're also going to put a lot of load on these other production systems because we're going to be querying them constantly. So then another possible approach to solve this problem might be a data lake. And with this approach, we can use Hadoop and HDFS to store all of our documents as is, just throw them all in there, and then use analytics and batch jobs to pull out this information to get what we need to answer our questions. But this approach is more suited for analytics than it is for real-time operations. Security is difficult because things are just dumped into the Hadoop HDFS. You have no clue necessarily how it got there and who has access to that information. And then data is batch-oriented, and there aren't indexes. So it's not going to perform as well. And in reality, this is all I want to do. I just want to represent my data independent of use case. I like to keep all of my data, don't lose or leave things behind. Preserve data lineage. Where did this stuff come from? How did it get here? I'd like to get started now. I don't want to have to build an entire system before I can load one single piece of data. That's going to take way too long. I like to be able to handle change, because as we know, things are going to change. So let me talk about this new way of doing things. You guys have probably seen this slide before. This is the MarkLogic approach to data integration. And there are 4 steps here. The first step is ingest as is, then we access the data, harmonize and enrich, and operationalize. So what do these mean? Ingest as is. Take all of your data, just load it straight away. It's there, it's searchable. And because we have a universal index, you can access that data and investigate it, understand it. During the harmonize and enrich step, you can take that data as is and transform just the pieces that you need to get the minimum amount of data necessary for the use case you're trying to solve. And then with the operationalize step, all of our enterprise features let you run in real time with enterprise-grade security. So loading data as is, you guys have probably heard this many times, but we do load all of these formats here as is. Just load them right into MarkLogic. MLCP is one of the common tools that we use. We also have REST APIs, Java client, Node, various other ways to get data into MarkLogic. And once it's there, you can leave it as it is. You don't have to worry about throwing away pieces of information. It's all there for you to use. You can skip the ETL, just load it. The next step is data harmonization. And this is kind of the magic here, because you don't want to have to design your entire data model up front. So you can just take out the bits that you need for the particular use case. A very small piece of what you need. And then later on, when things change and you realize that I need more data, you can go back, because you have the original source data still in MarkLogic, and you can extract out the pieces that you need to use later without re-ingesting. And what we typically, you can see this use case here is this standardizing male and female. This is a common case for harmonization, because when we're bringing in data from multiple silos, and I think someone in the last session asked this question, what if the formats are way different and I have to get them all in the same format? That's where harmonization comes in. You take all this different data, and then you harmonize it on the fly into what you need, and that's just the bare bones. This is how we do it. This is called the envelope pattern. And you might hear this term a lot. Envelope pattern, there's the XML and then the JSON representation. We simply take your original data, put it in the content section, and then you have a headers and a triple section. And in the header section, you would place the things like the normalized dates, normalized genders, things that are common to all of your data that belong in your data model. The content section contains the original content, so it's all there. You don't lose anything. And then triples, if you have relationships about your data, you can materialize them in the triple section. Now I want to talk about the operational data hub pattern. And this, while it looks complicated, it's actually 3 simple steps that we just talked about. First step is ingest. Then there's the harmonize step, and then there's the serve step. The step to look at your data is kind of implicit in here. So again, same concepts, load it, harmonize just what you need, puts them inside of these envelope documents, and now you can serve it up to your downstream system using the MarkLogic built-ins, like the REST API or MLCP for batch exports. All right, so our second takeaway was that MarkLogic Data Hub Framework makes all of this super easy. And first thing you might be asking is, well, what is the MarkLogic Data Hub Framework? And the MarkLogic Data Hub Framework is an open source tool that the community team has created, and it is available on GitHub. And this framework is meant to streamline the development of operational data hubs using MarkLogic. It ships as a Java library, which means you can use it within your own custom Java applications, and you can use it from the command line. So it is perfect for running in a headless production environment. It is production ready. We have 2 instances already in production. We have 1 in pre-production and 3 paid proofs of concept. There may be more that have popped up since I made this slide that I'm not aware of yet. DevOps Focused, developer operations. When we made this framework, we wanted to focus on the developers and make it extremely easy to build a data hub quickly. This thing lowers the barrier to entry. And what do we mean by that? With MarkLogic, traditionally, to get started, you have to learn a lot of stuff, like app servers, forests, databases. You have to know how to get your modules into the modules database. There's so much information that you have to learn before you can even get started that it becomes kind of an overwhelming task. With the Data Hub Framework, we abstract that away. It's all there, but you just don't have to see it initially. We encourage best practices. I talked about the envelope pattern. The envelope pattern is what we consider a best practice. And it encourages you to do that because it pretty much makes you do that. The Data Hub Framework, as I will mention, is really just an engine for building envelopes. Guardrails to keep you on the road. Some of you who have done MarkLogic for a while might know that it's easy to shoot yourself in the foot. It's really, really easy to write a poor performing query if you don't know what you're doing. But we make it easy because we have some guardrails and some scaffolding that get you going in the right direction so that you're not off to a bad start. And I mentioned this, but the Data Hub Framework focuses on harmonizing your data. That is the key point of what the Data Hub Framework does. And by harmonizing, I mean building envelopes. So let me remind you of this pattern here. And as I said before, the data comes in, but then the harmonization step is where the Data Hub Framework focuses its attention. It doesn't really care how data gets in. It just wants to harmonize that data. And then once it's harmonized, MarkLogic takes care of the serving part. All right, so just for refreshing our memory, here's the envelope pattern. And I'm bringing it up again because I'm going to talk about the little sections in it, the headers, the triples, and the content. And that is because the Data Hub is designed to build an envelope. This is what we call a harmonization data flow. And a data flow is the process of taking a batch of information and converting it into envelopes. So the first phase of this is something we call a collector. And this is a piece of code that gets written. And this piece of code simply returns a list of things to process. It's really strings, but it can be anything. It could be the URI of a document. It could be an ID from a database table. It could be anything you want it to be. Then the Data Hub Framework will take the information from the collector, and it will parallelize the process of the middle section, which is these user-written plugins that build envelopes. The way that works is the content piece starts first, and the output of content goes into the content section of the envelope. But it's also passed into the headers plugin. So the headers plugin can see what came out of content, and then it spits out something, and that goes into triples, and then that goes here, and the writer piece gets the full envelope. So content creates content section, headers creates header, triples creates triples, but the writer actually writes the final envelope into MarkLogic. Now, it can do more than that. It's a piece of code. You can do what you want, but by default, it writes it into MarkLogic. So if you want to send it off to the cloud, put it on a JMS queue, you can do all of that from within the writer. And then, of course, there's the writer. There's the example of the envelope coming out. OK, so we also have what we call the Quick Start user interface. And if any of you have seen a demo of the MarkLogic Data Hub Framework, you might be thinking of this. So this is sugar. This is coding on top of the Data Hub Framework. And its purpose is to make your life even easier. In production, you typically won't be running this on your server, right? This is just to make it easy to get up and running, to generate code, to kick off your jobs. But it's all possible, like I said, from the command line or via Java applications. All right, how many of you can build a data integration in 15 minutes? Anyone? All right, everyone's hand should be up right now, because if you're going to use MarkLogic, you can do it in 15 minutes. In fact, we're going to do that right now. Let me just switch over, and we will build a data integration live. OK, so the first thing I want to point out is where to get this thing. Right here. This is the GitHub page for the Data Hub Framework. You simply come over to the releases section, and you download the WAR file. Again, this is the Quick Start user interface. The jar file itself is available through Maven or any other Java repository, if you guys are that. But if you download this, this is a self-contained application that you can run locally, where you don't require anything but Java to be running, and of course, MarkLogic. Once you download it, you have the WAR file, as you see there, sitting in a directory. I also have an input directory, and I'll talk about that in a second. And it's really simple to get started. You just do java jar, and then the name of the file, and you run it. And then it's going to start up the Quick Start application. And I can come over here and load it up. So now I am looking at the MarkLogic Data Hub Framework. And it starts off, and it wants to create a project. Well, we don't have a project yet, so I'm just going to use the current folder that we've started in. And now it's telling me that it needs to initialize the project, because as you saw a moment ago, my folder simply has the WAR file, nothing else. And the Data Hub project is going to make it easy for you to go right into production, because it's going to create some Gradle files for you. Gradle, for those that don't know, is a Java-based tool or Groovy-based tool for deploying applications, specifically in the Java ecosystem. So I'm just going to initialize this thing with the default settings. You can get in here and get crazy and change all kinds of MarkLogic things like ports and forest names and all that jazz. We're not going to do that. We're just going to initialize with a very straightforward names that are already there. You can see now my directory looks a little bit different. It's created a bunch of files for me. These are the Gradle project files that represent the Data Hub, and then some other directories that tell our Gradle installation what is necessary for this application to run inside of MarkLogic. Then next, I'm going to choose my environment. This supports multiple environments like local, QA, dev, production, all that. We're just going to be working with local today. And then we need to authenticate to our MarkLogic server. It's going to do a quick check. It's going to realize that this Data Hub framework is not installed in MarkLogic, and it will offer to do that for me. While it's installing, it will take a minute. I will show you guys what we're going to be working on today. We're going to do a data integration, and we will be loading data from our online shopping system. The input directory looks like this. And today, because we are doing this in 15 minutes, I am just going to focus on one of these data sources. It will be products. So let me dig in here to my code editor so I can show you some of the files. So the products directory you can see I have, hopefully you can see that. It's a little small. I can't zoom that in, unfortunately. Maybe I can actually, no. There's four CSV files. Each of these CSV files represents a different type of product that we will be loading into our system. We have board games, board game accessories, board game apparel, and extensions to the board games. And I want to show you what these look like. These are CSV table dumps. And you can see that they have IDs, SKUs, titles, all kinds of stuff. And they're not all the same. They definitely have different fields. So what we need to do today is design a kind of bare bones harmonized model. What is it that we need for this particular use case that we can get away with just doing the minimum? We're going to load this data as is. Then we're going to do the harmonization step to get just that bare bones piece. So it looks like it's ready. So now we're inside the hub. I've explained what the data sort of looks like. We'll get into a little bit more detail in a minute. But we're looking at the dashboard screen. This just gives me the counts of the documents in my databases. You'll notice that we have 4 databases. We have staging and final. So the concepts behind this are that when the data is loaded, it goes into our staging database. And it is kept separate from our final database. And there's multiple reasons for that. The data might not look the same, so you might have different indexes. You might want to keep more lineage information in your staging database, and your final database might be just for serving to downstream systems. There's lots of reasons you want to keep them separate. We also have a job database. The jobs database is simply just to track every time you've run one of these harmonization flows. And then we have something called the trace database, which I think is really cool. It is a little bit like a debugging. And the way it works is when a document comes through that flow that I mentioned, I showed you guys the steps. It was content, headers, triples, writer. When it goes through that flow, the tracing actually logs the input and output to every single step along the way. So we can go back and reconstruct exactly what happened for each and every document that comes through the system, and you can see where something may have worked or not worked. That, as you might be asking, well, isn't that a little expensive? And yes, it is. So you wouldn't turn that on in production. But the even cooler thing is that in production, if an error occurs anywhere, a trace is automatically logged, even if it's turned off. So you still get the benefit of using it without having to turn it on. I'm going to kind of walk through the entities piece and show you guys how we're going to do some modeling. In MarkLogic 9, we have a new feature called Entity Services, and this build of the Data Hub Framework takes advantage of that. Entity Services is a way to specify a entity data model, and it's JSON notation that represents that model. So we've created a UI to create these models to make it a little bit easier, and from that model, we can do some really cool stuff. So we can tell the model which of the fields are indexed. We can tell which ones are primary keys. We can point to other entities. And with that information in the model, MarkLogic can then generate for you index configurations so that you can load them into the server and automatically have indexes. It can create search configurations, which means that you can then facet on your data. For those that don't know faceting, it's like you're looking at Amazon.com, you look at the left side, and it's the counts of all the stuff, like men's shoes, 25, or those are facets. So we can automatically generate that information, at least the configuration for that, off of the model. And then we can also create TDE definitions. So TDE is another feature, template-driven extraction in MarkLogic 9. And TDE allows you to find columnar data within your documents and represent those as rows and columns. So let me go ahead and create our product entity. And this is going to be really simple because I don't know yet. I haven't loaded my data. I don't even know what I want it to look like. So I'm just going to create this concept of an entity. And there it is. There's my bare bones entity. It has no information. There's no properties defined. I don't know anything about it. But I want to load it as is so that I can come back and then harmonize it later. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go to my Flows tab. And the flows, there's two types. There's input and harmonize. I only showed you the slide for harmonize. Input's a little bit simpler because we're not doing batches. It's just the data's coming in, and it's being turned into an envelope. So I'm going to create an input flow, load products. And because I don't have an entity definition really created yet, there's no fields defined, I'm just going to do a blank template. I'm going to write this plugin in JavaScript, and I'm going to model my data as JSON. All right, I've created that. There it is. And now if I click on it, because this is an input flow, the Quick Start user interface is going to let me run MLCP or MarkLogic Content Pump, for those of you that might be familiar. It is a command line tool that lets you ingest data into MarkLogic. If you've ever used it, you know that there are about a bazillion options on how to configure it, and no one can ever remember what all the features are or what the flags are. So luckily, this little user interface lets us do that. I'm going to click on the input folder, and I'm going to choose my products folder. So the data in products is what I'm going to load. I am going to load this. The source documents are actually delimited text CSV files. And I want the document type to be JSON. And then I'm going to do something called generate URI because I want my file names to be randomly generated versus pulling the first column out. And then I'm going to click the run import, and it's going to kick off the product loading. And in just a moment, it will be finished. You can see I'm getting a progress bar up there, and we're finished. Now we've loaded all this data, and I can go over here to the Browse Data tab and see that it is, in fact, loaded 450 documents. So what is a document? Well, I didn't show you the data yet, but a document, my source data, here it is. Each of these rows is getting broken out into its own document. So there are total, between all four of these tables, there are 450 rows. And if I look at one of these, you can see what's happened here is that I've created that envelope I talked about, and the part called instance is where the actual original data came in. So it was rows or columns, and now it's JSON. I'll show you my jobs tab. The jobs tab is where we get our jobs history. You can see that I ran an input flow. It had that big long name or ID. It was on entities. And I can, if I want to, pull up the output of MLCP, see what happened. Or I can click on this little lightning bolt, and I can show the traces that belong to just this particular job. All right, and I can look at any one of these traces. So here is, and this is the kind of debugging information I was telling you guys about. So the raw content that came in, it looked like this. And MLCP took care of converting that row into this format. And so the output was simply the same thing we got. We just passed it through. Then we had a header section. And the output of the header section, we didn't return any output. And then we had a triple section. And then that went into our writer. So the final thing that got generated was this entire envelope, and it got written. And you might be asking, well, how did it know to do all this stuff? That's because when we created that flow, it actually went to my disk, and it scaffolded for me some code. And it looks like this. 3 folders. Each one has an SJS file, server-side JavaScript, and each of these conforms to a certain function signature, automatically created for you. You just have to fill in the bits. But the cool thing is, by default, it just does what you want it to do, which is just load the data. So you actually can just create it like I did, run it, and then it will, 9 times out of 10, it will work for you, just like it did. You can see in my header section here, I actually returned an empty object, so no headers. And then for triples, an empty array. So we had no triples. So it just passed through the data and wrapped it up nicely in an envelope. Now, if I did have information about where this data came from, when it was loaded, all that stuff, I could go into the header section and put all that in there. And then it would be inside of my final envelope. So now that I've loaded this data, I want to do a harmonization step. And in order to do that, I have to understand my data a little bit, because I have to know, well, what are the key items that I want to pull out of it? And because we're doing a pretty small, simple demo here, the things I'm going to pull out are SKU, because every one of these products has its own SKU. Every one has a title, and they all have a price. So I'm going to go back to my entities, and I'm going to model these 3 fields, and then we're going to talk about harmonization. So here I am. I can just click the Edit button, add my properties. I'm going to do a SKU, and this will be a string. I'm going to make this my primary key, by the way. And next up, I would have title, string, and then I would do price, and I will make this one a decimal. And save it. OK, so now I've modeled my entity. And it asked me if I want to update my indexes. I did mention to you that based on this model's configuration, we can then drive which indexes are created within MarkLogic. It's offering to do this for me automatically. I'll agree and let it do that. So now I want to create a harmonization step. I'm going to go into my flows. I'm going to create a new harmonization flow. And this one, I'll just call it Harmonize Products, if I can spell. So this time, I'm going to use the entity definition, because it's going to tell the Data Hub Framework to scaffold my code based on this definition. So all I have to do is go fill in the blanks after this is done. And I'm going to stick with JavaScript and JSON and just go ahead and create that. And if I go down here to the Harmonize folder, you can see that it's created collector, content, headers, triples, writer, just the things I talked about earlier. And to give you a kind of a peek here, collector is going to return a list of things to operate, an array of IDs or URIs. And this statement, CTS URIs right there, is going to return every single URI of every single document within MarkLogic. That's not really what we want to do, but we will we'll come back to it. Content, this is the cool part. This is scaffolded based on that entity definition. So the other one that you saw was, I think, really simple. Let's see, yeah, there it is, return raw content, right? So this one's a little different because there's no raw content coming in. And the reason for that is because we're operating on an ID and not on incoming data. This ID could be a number, it could be a URI, it could be anything. We don't know what it is. So we have to make a decision what to do with it. Now, the scaffolded code is making an assumption. We're assuming, OK, yeah, you're returning the URI of a document. So let's just open up this document, which we do here. We get the root of the document. And then there's some boilerplate code here to make your life easier. We check the document, and we say, is this an envelope? If it's already an envelope, then just pull out the thing that was in the instance. And that, if you recall from me showing you the data, is just the original content. So all this code here just grabs out the original content and assigns it to the source variable. And then we pass it to this extract instance product function down here at the bottom. And what does this do? Well, this is where we actually build the model that's going to represent the entity within MarkLogic. And you can see, based on that definition that we created in the user interface, it knows that we have a SKU, a title, and a price. And it knows that the first 2 are strings and the last is a decimal. And then it knows to return a JSON object with a bunch of stuff filled in. So what is this stuff? Attachments is Entity Services' way of referring to the original content that came in your system. So if you want to keep that original content and move it over to your harmonization database, you can do so by putting it in the attachments section. Type, it's a product. That's just the type of the entity. And then there's the fields that are required, or at least not required, but those are the fields that we define, SKU, title, and price. So all we have to do is make sure that the assignments on line 45, 6, and 7 are correct. Is it actually grabbing the right thing out of the documents? And I can tell you right now that it is not. And I know because I've cheated and looked ahead. So the first one, it just so happens that it is SKU, as you can see here, title, and price. That is correct. It will work for this apparel CSV. But what happens when I look at the board game? Whoops, that's uppercase. So this is our data quality issue. We have 2 different names for the same thing. We need to make sure that we account for that when we do our harmonization step. And this is like a dirt simple example, but it's something that you probably see a lot. So what we're going to do here is, we know that this will work for the apparel, but we know that it will not work for the board game because of the all caps. So using a little JavaScript magic here, I can just do that. And that's all I need to do. It will say whichever one it is, grab it, make sure it gets assigned to SKU. And for this case, this is pretty simple. I'm not doing any date transforms or anything, but it's illustrating a good point. So I've now created my code. I can go back over to my flow section, and now I can kick off this flow. And I did mention it's a batch process to create envelopes. And because it's a batch process, we can say how many items are in each batch, and how many threads do we want to devote to doing this. And then we just press the button. And now it's going to kick off and build our envelopes. And it's done. So when I go now to my Jobs tab, you can see that I ran the harmonize. It's finished. And if I click on the trace icon, I will see the traces for each and every one of those envelopes. So here's a board game extension. And similar concept, but remember, we don't have a source input. The source that came into us was really this identifier, which happens to be the URI of the document. So because the identifier can be anything, there's no input. But the output was that whole thing was in our content section. The attachments, like I told you, is the original document that came in. The type was set to product, hard-coded, and then we have our SKU, our title, and our price was converted from a string to a decimal. But let's look and see if the board game worked. And it looks like it did, because it came in as in all caps, and we accounted for that, so it got pulled over. And just like that, we have ingested data and harmonized. Now we can go actually and look at our final database and look at our entities. And we can go browse that data just the same as we did the staging data. And if we went back to our model, we could then extend our model to turn on indexes. And if you turn on indexes, then you get the faceting. And just a reminder, the faceting was this stuff here. This counts. So you can turn that on just by updating the model. Does that look cool? We did it, 15 minutes. So now we can all raise our hands. We can all integrate data. All right, now let me get back to my PowerPoint, and we'll finish this guy up. Where is it? All right, so we answered that question. That's where you get it. I went to the web page and showed you guys how to get it. I want to mention that there are training courses available for this. Our MarkLogic University does offer a self-paced data hub training. We also have a MarkLogic World hands-on session. It's already full, so that's not going to work for you guys if you haven't already gotten in. But we do have 2 other sessions if you're interested in a hands-on session on Thursday. We have a security and I believe a data modeling workshop. And now I'll take questions. All right, but before I give you we have this cool thing here. This is a microphone, so make sure you talk into the microphone so that we can all hear you because we're being recorded. They're watching us.
How would it work with bitemporality?
With bitemporal, when you get to the writer phase, you have to do a bitemp insert. So that's why we make the writer customizable so that you can do that. And we do have people using the Data Hub Framework with bitemp. So it works just fine. If you could sling that over there, that would be awesome.
So are all the services in Entity Services available as APIs, or do we have to use that UI?
It's Entity Services, the definition of the entity is just a JSON document. In fact, I can show you guys real quick what that looks like. So this UI was just made out of convenience, but really it's just JSON. Here's the the thing I modeled. It's not all visible there, but that's what it looks like. So it's documented in the documentation on developer.marklogic.com. You can go and create your own entities without using the UI. Can you get that over this way? We got one up here in the front. Put you guys to work. This is awesome. Yes, sir.
So this is all cool, but what if I want to do the entire flow in real time?
In real time?
In real time, end-to-end ingestion, harmonization, building the final JSON or whatever be the document that I want to expose to the end users and make this as event-driven architecture.
Okay, yep.
So I have a lot of events coming in from several systems, hundreds of event types, and I want to integrate that in real-time fashion.
Okay. Yeah, so this case obviously was a batch example, but for real time, we offer there's a REST extension, or it's an extension or a REST transform on loading documents. So MarkLogic offers a REST API, and you would call that API to insert your document. And when you do so, the flow that you choose will automatically be triggered right then and there as soon as the document's inserted. So it's completely possible to do it real time like that. We also have one of our customers is actually using the CPF, the Content Pipeline Framework, to do a trigger-based approach to launching the real time as well. But it's completely possible, and there's multiple ways to do it. Anyone else?
Hi.
Hey.
I just want to go through and just ask, with tracing, is there any type of adapters for using, like for app dynamics or Tivoli monitoring, Splunk, anything like that?
No. It's right now it's just logging into that tracing database. So if you wanted to get it into Splunk or any of these other tools, then you would have to find a fun way to do that. You can either have a job that was exporting them, or you could set up a CPF to export it automatically. But the cool thing is this is an open source project, right? And so we're taking any and all ideas. So if you have something that you want to see happen, then file a ticket on our GitHub site and we can make that part of our roadmap.
So let me see if I can ask again. There's no type of like JMX that you could be able to go call from your own monitoring system for alerts to be generated in the event that there's something that happens in production?
Yeah, so let's think of like a Splunk instance. You know, you're typically watching like a log file, right? And you're looking for certain error messages, for example. If you're using a Splunk with a MarkLogic, you can watch the log file for an error to be logged, and then you could trigger your event. But I mean, the hub itself is, the tracing is more designed for you as the developer creating these flows to be able to make sure that things are working correctly. And then kind of a side effect from that is we said, okay, well in production, there might be some weird edge case that we didn't know about that came through and blows something up. That's why it still fires in production. Again, you can work around that by watching the file system logs or having something to pull the database to get that information. But by default, right now, it doesn't export to those things.
Okay.
Looks like we have a few more questions.
Hey, Paxton.
Dave?
You mentioned the Data Hub Framework being used in production.
Yes.
What we saw on GitHub had the word alpha. Do you want to say a
Yes,
couple
thank
words
you.
about the versions?
Yes. So the Data Hub Framework has two versions, and thank you, I forgot to mention that. So the first version is 1.x. It is in production, like I showed you guys the slides, and that was built on MarkLogic 8. You can go and use it in your own production right now. The one I just demoed is centered around the new MarkLogic 9 features. Since we just announced its availability, this version is still in alpha and will be undergoing a few more changes before we make that one production ready. So right now, 1x production ready, and then you would use this one when it's ready for your 9 installations.
Hi.
Hey.
can we use it as a headless version, headless utility, and just invoke one Java method and use it in a scheduler to schedule my jobs?
Yes, absolutely. So the Data Hub framework is just a Java jar file. Okay, that means it's a library that you can use from your own applications. The UI is just an extra piece that we put on top of it to make it easy to use. Every single one of our production instances is using it headless. They're using the jar, and they're calling into the method to kick off these flows as needed. So they might be watching a directory. There's so many things they could be doing to decide when they want to fire off those batches. And that's totally possible, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? One more?
Are there other methods of ingestion? What are the supported ways of ingesting the data other than CSV files? Can we go to SQL or?
Yeah, so
database?
the MarkLogic loads data that's in XML, JSON, text, binary, RDF, and those are the ways that you would typically load data. If you have SQL, a SQL system, you can connect to it and then pull that data in. I'm showing you this because it's easy to have a CSV file and load, but we do have people using things like Apache Spark or Spring Batch to get data from relational systems into MarkLogic. Got one more.
We are having Cloudera also in our environment. How is it different from Cloudera environment? There we have the partitions, over here we have the indexes. If I want to replace my Cloudera system, how well will the new MarkLogic 9 perform?
And you want to replace what system?
Cloudera Hadoop.
Okay. How well will MarkLogic perform?
Yeah.
Extremely well. Extremely well. Come see me after the talk, and we'll talk about it.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. I think we're right at time, right? Close. All right. Anyone else? Going once? No. All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate you guys coming out.